Hello, everybody. Decided to switch things up, change my background. I'm outside, so if you hear birds chirping or cows mooing or horses neighing, it's just because I'm outside. Welcome to week 9. This week we are going to be talking about chapter 15, which is variant sexual behavior, also known as kinks and fetishes and BDSM. So this is one of my favorite chapters because it's stuff that we really don't talk a lot about, but it's something that I think everybody should be talking about, even if it's not your jam or anything that you're interested in. I think it's a really important sort of thing to do. So this topic might push the boundaries of your comfort zone, and that's okay. It's totally fine to be like, I have no idea why somebody would find this attractive. I'm uncomfortable with this. I have feelings about it. But I think it's a really important sort of thing to keep an open mind and to think about these sort of things from this very sex positive sort of view. If it's not hurting anybody, then why do we care what anybody else is doing? As we said previously in the semester, when we talk about sort of how we measure stuff, sexual behaviors that are atypical, meaning most people don't do these, are the things that we're going to talk about this week. Sexual variation that are not statistically typical of the larger U.S. population. That being said, remember they are atypical and not abnormal. They're just things that most people don't do. Oftentimes we refer to these sort of behaviors in a big picture as kinky or non-vanilla, right? Vanilla ice cream, everybody will eat because it's just, whatever. But not everybody likes pistachio or, I don't know, raisin or guacamole flavored ice cream. And so we would just say non-vanilla to encapsulate all of those different sort of things. We will talk about some disorders that talk a lot more about, causing people distress, either harm or other sort of damage. And those things can be classified as a mental disorder. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, about how we decide between those sort of things. When we talk about sort of things that cause distress, either to the person who's experiencing them or people around them, it's defined as a paraphilic behavior. And so later I'm going to have you look at a list, and it's under the wide classification of paraphilic behaviors, but it's kind of a misnomer because most of them aren't actually paraphilias. Most of them are just kinks and sort of non-vanilla behavior. So when we talk about statistical sort of atypical sexual interests, I would say, based on our best sort of guess of research and literature, that's about 1% of the population, right? 1% is statistically very, very, very small, right? But if we think about how many people are here in the United States, right? 300 million people are approximately living in the United States. That number goes sort of up and down and all around. But we'll round it to 300 million people live in the United States. 1% of that, I know I'm testing your math skills, is 3 million people, right? So when we say 1%, that doesn't seem like a lot. But when we say 3 million people are participating in atypical sexual behaviors, that's a significant number of people, right? And so we should know about these sort of things, even if it's not something that a lot of people are participating in. So talking about sort of where does it turn from just an atypical sexual interest to a mental health disorder or something that would be classified as a paraphilic disorder. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association, is sort of our diagnosing Bible of what we use in the United States to diagnose whether or not something is a mental health issue. And so the DSM has been around for many decades. Every decade or so, there are some big adjustments that psychologists get together. They have meetings, they talk about all these sort of things and say, where do we need to make adjustments? Because contemporary sort of ideas of sex and sexuality and mental health and other sort of things change over time. And so we move with those sort of things, right? And so the DSM-5 is the most recent DSM, and it had a substantial overwork from DSM-4 to DSM-5 talking about atypical sexual sexual interests. At this point, all the psychologists who got together really said most things that are atypical are not psychological disorders. Most things are just sort of kinky behaviors that most of us just don't practice, and that's okay. The requirements for it to be a mental health disorder or a paraphilic disorder is that a person needs to feel distress over the behavior or the interest. And this is not just distress from like society's going to think I'm a weirdo and so now I'm distressed. It's actual sort of an internal sense of I feel bad and horrible that I feel this way and it disgusts me and these sort of things. And so you have to have a deep personal distress for it, number one, to be even considered a paraphilic disorder. And then the disorder or the behavior or the interest has to involve distress of both either yourself or another person. So the distress would be considered sort of major distress, the desire to hurt somebody, the desire to kill somebody. And so that is a really important sort of thing. If you're doing behaviors to people who are not willing to in a non-consensual sort of way, yeah, those would classify as paraphilic disorders. And we'll talk more about those later in the lecture. But basically what APA said and what we now understand is that if you're not in distress and you're not hurting anybody, then yeah, you don't have a paraphilia. You don't have any sort of mental health disorder. You just have a kinky mind and you like some kinky sort of stuff outside of the norm. And that's totally okay. So one of the things that kind of stems from this is we have to be very careful about thinking about words or ideas that we think have scientific or sort of clinical names, but aren't really scientific at all. One of those would be nymphomania. I have a lot of students who will be like, oh, I think I'm a nympho, or I've heard about nymphomania. Nymphomania is not actually a real term. It comes from sort of Greek mythology of women who were so overcome with sexual desire that they just couldn't stop having sex with people, right? As we've talked about in this class, we know that women's sexuality is highly monitored and stigmatized. And so actually, yeah, nymphomania was really just something that a societal judgment came up and then they made it sound sort of scientific. The equivalent term for sort of sex-obsessed males is satyriasis. Have you heard of that word? Probably not, right? Because what is a male who is obsessed with sex? Oh, we would just call that a typical sort of American kid, right? And so we just have to be really careful about these words that sound sort of clinical, but oftentimes are not. And then oftentimes we, as I said, the DSM updates and other sort of things. And for a long time, there's been a lot of science or pseudoscience that has worked around trying to make people feel bad about different sort of things. And so homosexuality was considered a mental health disorder up until 1973, right? Can you believe that? And so 1973, finally the DSM was like, yeah, this is not a thing. Like people are not mentally disordered because they are gay. It's just sort of an atypical sexual interest, right? Atypical being less than the majority. And we know the LGBTQ population makes up about 10% of the population. So that would be statistically in the minority. And so just be really careful when you're reading sort of things to figure out, is this a legitimate thing? Is this just somebody trying to use fancy words to make us think that something is a mental illness? So when we think about sort of non-coercive paraphilias, again, if they're not causing distress, they're not really paraphilias, they're just kinks or other sort of things. These are relatively harmless. They're benign. They're not something that is too concerning because they're not hurting anybody. Oftentimes we will call these, instead of non-coercive paraphilias, fetishes or kinks, because that's just a less judgmental sort of way to use it. Now, for this week, I'm going to have you look at the Wikipedia list that is the paraphilias list. As I said, they're not really paraphilias, they're just kinks and fetishes for the most part. There are some in there that are paraphilias. I want you to scroll through the Wikipedia list and look it over, see what's in there. The one thing I love about Wikipedia is you can always find more information. And so all the hyperlinks, you could get lost for hours, I have, looking at different sort of kinks and fetishes and all these other sort of things. Some of them are debatable, some of them are, again, Wikipedia is public derived. And so some of them that are in there are questionable as whether they're actually a kink or some sort of thing. All of them have citations about where somebody found an idea of something, but some of them are much more sort of this one time a psychologist saw somebody and they wrote it down, and it's not really a thing. Whereas some fetishes, like say a foot fetish, is a very widespread and common fetish. And so you can find out a lot of information about that. It's really hard to study kinks and fetishes because most people, A, feel bad about them and don't want to tell people about them, and because they're only practiced by about 1% of the population, there's a lot of people that don't do these sort of things. And so it's hard to do large scale sort of research on kinks and fetishes. Okay. Now, when we talk about coercive paraphilias, and these are things that do cause harm. So these things would be considered a mental disorder because they're either hurting the person who is involved, or they're hurting some sort of unconsenting being. And so these involve victimization. They are oftentimes something that society is quite, good Lord, that society is concerned about because it is something that causes harm. So one of those sort of things would be zoophilia. Zoophilia is oftentimes referred to as bestiality, although zoophiles and bestiality practitioners would say that they are very different. Bestiality is just about sexual sort of attraction to animals, whereas zoophiles often say, no, I have a relationship with the animal, and we've somehow managed interspecial communication, and we have a relationship. And so it's not just about the sex, it's about a relationship. Animals can't consent because consent is a uniquely human idea. And so zoophilia and bestiality are both considered mental health disorders. They're both illegal and something that is punishable by the criminal justice system. Voyeurism and exhibitionism sort of go hand in hand. It's important to know that you can also be a voyeur and exhibitionist with consent, and then therefore it wouldn't be a crime. When we're talking about voyeurism and exhibitionism in the non-coercive or in the coercive paraphilia sort of way, we mean without people's consent. We think of the peeping toms, people looking in your windows, thinking about people flashing people in public, their genitals and those sort of things. The people who are engaged in that are not getting consent and permission done from the people that they are victimizing. However, there are some people who are like, I kind of like that, but I would never do it in a creepy sort of way. So voyeurs and exhibitionists might engage in going to sex clubs or having group sex so that they can be watching and showing off and doing different sort of things. In that case, it's not a mental health disorder. It's not a thing. If you can control that your desire to not engage non-consensual sort of people in it, then voyeurism and exhibition is a-okay, given those sort of parameters. It's when consent is not involved that it's a problem. Telephone scatologia, which is calling, dirty phone calls, not as popular these days now that we have spam blockers and caller ID and all those sort of things, but much more of a phenomenon that happened in a lot of different sort of ways. That can be really creepy, and people just calling and saying lewd things on the phone. Frauderism, which is the act of rubbing up against somebody for sexual pleasure. We often hear this in kind of media sensationalized stories of people stuck in a crowded subway or on a bus and somebody's rubbing up against them and ejaculates them or gets off on them or whatever. That would be coercive because the person who is being rubbed up against did not consent to that. And so that would be a crime and a concern. And then finally, necrophilia would be the act of having sex with a dead body. Consent is an active process. You have to be giving continual consent and be able to take it away. If you're dead, you can't take away consent. So even if somebody was like, yeah, when I die, you can totally like fuck my dead body. Yeah, actually, no, you can't according to sort of legal standards because you have to be able to give and take away consent, and dead people can't do that. And so that's why that would be illegal. Now, a special note on the idea of pedophilia. I find this to be a really interesting and unique sort of paraphilia because of the way that contemporary society sort of deals with this. So pedophilia is clearly a psychiatric disorder, okay? It is not okay to have sex with children. It's not okay to be attracted to children. The requirements of pedophilia are actually pretty strict, depending on sort of laws. The child victim has to be 13 or younger, and the perpetrator has to be 16 and older, and there has to be 5 years in between, right? And so if you're a 17-year-old and you have a 13-year-old partner, you wouldn't be a pedophile. It's not to say that behavior is condoned. It's not. But you wouldn't be qualified as a pedophile, right? It's not something that we would seek a psychiatric sort of treatment for. In addition, when we think about sort of gender patterns, we know that men are much more likely to be pedophiles, but we also know that women are way less likely to be reported as pedophiles. And so what the actual gender sort of difference is between male and female pedophiles is actually pretty somewhat unknown. We just know that males are much more likely to get caught and punished for it, whereas male victims of female pedophiles oftentimes are not caught. And it's because of this toxic masculinity that we have in society, where people are like, oh yeah, they definitely wanted it, and blah, 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 and all these other sort of weird things. And so while we think that males are much more likely to be pedophiles, we also know that the number of female pedophiles is probably drastically undercut. We also know that most pedophiles, based on sort of our research with pedophiles, it isn't actually about the gender of the child. So people often, have these sort of socially constructed ideas of like, oh, all gay men are pedophiles. That's what the right-wing sort of media likes to push. But in reality, most of the people who have been convicted of pedophilia are people who I self-identify as straight. Now, whether or not they had same-sex or opposite-sex sort of victims is largely irrelevant. For most pedophiles, they say, I'll abuse any kid. Any kid that is close to me is what it is, because I'm attracted to children, not necessarily boy children or girl children. Now, where I find it really interesting, and one of the sort of the current areas of debate, is what do we do with pedophiles who've never harmed anybody, right? I always like to think about these sort of things because when we think about sort of fetishes and kinks and paraphilias, all of these things are rooted in sort of obsessive compulsive sort of desires, right? People don't develop fetishes because they think it sounds fun. It's something that is happening sort of deep within the brain. It is compulsory. It is non-voluntary. People just one day wake up and they're like, oh wow, I really want to have sex with a tree, or other sort of things. And so for pedophiles, same thing sort of applies. One day they realize, oh, I am attracted to children. Oftentimes from our research, what we know is that people who are attracted to children start to realize this attraction right in their teenage sort of years. This is where some of this push for like, oh, pedophilia should be seen as a sexual orientation. I think that's a bit much. But a lot of the same sort of ideas of attraction to children happen to come up during this sort of time period of sexual expression. Now, if you're attracted to children, who are you going to tell? Probably no one, right? Because we know that anybody who says, oh, I'm sexually attracted to children, people are going to be like, you're a creep and you're gross, right? But what if somebody says, I know that it's wrong to be attracted to children. I never would want to, and yet I still have this compulsive sort of desire. What do we do with those sort of people? And this is where I think, thinking about these sort of things is really hard. In our contemporary society, if somebody did notice that they had sort of sexual attraction to children, but had never harmed anybody, would it matter? Or will we still treat them like dirt, right? And so there has been this really interesting rise of online groups in sort of internet world where people who are pedophiles, self-identified as, oh, I have attraction to children, come together in terms of social support. So social support groups online to say, I need help managing this. I need to talk to somebody who will understand this, but there's not anywhere that I can go. I can't tell my family that I'm attracted to children because then they'll all just think I'm a creep forever. A lot of therapists won't work with people who are pedophiles because they're additionally gonna treat them as if they are offenders. And so for people who genuinely want to not offend and hurt children, what do? Right now, we really don't have a good answer for those sort of things. When we think about sort of just in general, talking about sort of the research on the causes of kinks and fetishes and pedophilia and other paraphilias, it's really limited, right? As I said, there's not a lot of people who practice these. A lot of people don't want to be research subjects in these sort of things. Pedophile research mostly comes from people who are in jail. So people who have offended, who have acted on their sort of desires. And so that's a unique sort of population that is different from somebody who says, oh, I've never offended and I don't want to do those sort of things. And so a lot of the research is unknown. We don't know why people have kinks or desires, whether they're good, bad, or otherwise. We know that people who have really distressing paraphilias, so the ones that involve necrophilia or pedophilia and those sort of things, have grown up in dysfunctional environments often. And so we know that there is probably some layer of trauma that brings those in. But other than that, we don't really have a lot of great ideas about how paraphilias come about. A lot of therapists have found that paraphilias are really difficult to treat, just as other sort of compulsive behaviors. Yes, there's medications that can help. There's other sort of things that you can do in terms of behavior modification. But for the most part, those desires are still going to be there. It's just learning how to control them. And so that can be a pretty hard sort of thing to do, right? I'm going to break here because this video is really long, and then I'll pick up for the second video to talk about BDSM. All right, thanks.